Something happened over the last year that changed how people think about building software. Tools like Bolt, Replit, Cloud Code make it possible to describe what you want in plain language and get a working application in return. Not a mockup, not a wireframe, but a real functioning thing with screens, logic, and database behind it. The output quality improved fast enough that people who had never written code started building tools they actually use. Full of internal dashboards, client portals, workflow automations, even full products with user management and authentication payments. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Analytics Insight podcast, where we talk about the ever evolving tech space. And I'm your host, Priya Dialani. Now, Andrej Karapati, former AI lead at Tesla and co founder of OpenAI, coined the term in a viral post in February 2005, which he said that there's a new kind of coding which he calls vibe coding, where you fully give into the vibes, embrace exponentials, and forget that the code even exists. So the excitement is justified. These tools genuinely work. But in the rush to celebrate what's now possible, something important is being skipped. And it's not the code quality, it's the process that's supposed to come before the code. Let's welcome Priyank Kapadia, Senior Vice President, Data and AI, Bounteous Accolite, to decode what nobody's talking about in AI assisted engineering. Hi, Priyank, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Priya. And at the outset, let me thank you and the team, Priya, for having me on this conversation today. Much appreciated.
It's a pleasure, Priyank, to have you on our podcast. And I think the conversation today seems to be something very fun. I would say and something very insightful because, we have always been talking about the hype that's shaping the industry. But in this podcast with you, I think we are going to decode something that, nobody talks about. So, without wasting any further time, let's get started. And let's start by telling our listeners more about the organization, its specialization, and alongside a little bit about you, Priyank, and your role towards the company.
Thanks, Priya. And so I'll keep it really short, right? So Bounteous is a AI services firm, essentially where we are focusing on how agentic engineering meets human experiences to deliver business outcomes for our enterprise customers. We're about a 5,000 plus global organization cut across US, India, UK, Singapore, and other global regions. The key part of today's discussion and also the way we are thinking about from an organization standpoint is AI is really divided into two quadrants. One is tech for tech, the other one is tech for business. Essentially, tech for tech lands into everything around SDLC, product engineering. How do we ensure productivity of engineers, product managers, data engineers, etc., kind of improve? That's the tech for tech tools. So the other one is more tech for business. And in lieu of that, Bounteous has four solution areas essentially. One is intelligent product engineering. The second one, we call it agentic business process reinvention. And the third one is AI enhanced experiences, right? And obviously the fourth one being the modern business platforms, right? So that's where we bring in transformation, AI, and how it can really practically launch solutions for our customers in truly pragmatic manner of sorts. Because building AI solutions is straightforward, but what's most important is the next piece is the change management. How do you deploy these solutions? How do you change the behavior? How do you change the business processes? There's so much to it, right? And these are the four solution areas that we predominantly focus on. Now, the other part of who am I? You've already called out as part of my role, I take care of the AI strategy, delivery, and the overall business development for data and AI across multiple business verticals within the organization. I also head up our EMEA data and AI practice. And that's a brief about myself, but I'm really excited to having these conversations about what are we heading towards? What do we mean by specs? What do we mean by vibes? Right. I'm personally excited about today's topic because it's something I've been living with every day, both in terms of building AI systems for our customers and our clients, and also in rethinking how engineering teams need to work in this new world. So, looking forward to this discussion once again.
Great, Priyank, and thank you for sharing the overview about the company and also about your role. And I think I'm really glad to understand how you are helping steer the direction of the company in the most meaningful way that is much needed in today's AI era and not going with the hype that you mentioned that is tech for tech. Moving ahead, now in most mid to large tech companies, AI coding tools have moved from experimental to standard infrastructure. Nearly all large organizations report some level of AI adoption. On the surface, this looks like a major productivity breakthrough. Yet, for many engineering organizations, one key metric has barely moved. That is delivery velocity. Teams generate more code, open larger pull requests, and complete individual tasks faster. But the overall cadence of shipping features to customers has remained roughly the same. So the gap between the reported productivity and measured output has a specific cause, and it is not the coding speed, if the listeners are guessing that. So, despite widespread adoption of AI coding tools, why are we still seeing higher bug rates and limited improvements in actual delivery speed?
Very valid question, right? And I'll directly jump into the root cause. What I call this problem as the productivity paradox, Priya. Making individual developers faster does not make organizations deliver features faster. It's important to deliver reliable features faster than just generating code faster. I think that's not the intention. And I think that's where the productivity paradox comes in, right? So you have to redesign. So what you've seen within the organization is organizations have adopted what you had earlier called out, right? The vibe coding, which Andre Karpathy famously coined in 2025. What vibe coding did was it described what you want. It then let AI generate. You accepted the suggestions, you stayed in the flow. Great. These and this specific workflow that I just mentioned works great for prototypes and hackathons. It's brilliant. I use it myself for some of these quick wins that we want to share with our businesses, right? But the majority of enterprise engineering is within brownfield projects. That means you need to know existing architectures, you need to know shared libraries, you need to know rules of the projects, what are the best practices, what are the do's and don'ts, etc., etc. But when vibe coding type behavior hits brownfield projects, the agent that you're eventually using or the tools that you're leveraging ignores all those best practices, those design systems. It starts reinventing services that already exist. It makes architectural choices which no one or nobody really validated at the first place. So you end up mixing vibe coding with the practicality of what AI really wants to generate, and you end up fixing more than what you kind of saved of sorts, right? So what that really means is organizations have to redesign how knowledge is persisted, how intents are reviewed, how outputs get reviewed of sorts, right? And how teams align on that intent. And that's where I feel we are seeing more of this happening, where it's just random behavioral going on, right? So I keep saying this, we've always confused faster code generation with faster software delivery. Code is just one artifact in a much larger system of alignment, verification, and trust, etc. But the real shift happens when you change and bring in different paradigm to how AI native engineering or agentic engineering, as it's going today, needs to be implemented.
That's a fascinating reality check. And, I think what we are seeing is that while AI coding tools are accelerating code generation, they are not necessarily accelerating the software delivery as a whole. Because writing code is just one piece of a much larger system. There's validation, integration, testing, security, long-term maintenance. And in many cases, AI is shifting, effort rather than eliminating it. So, I think the transition from writing code to curating or validating and governing code is there, but the transition isn't frictionless. It requires new skills and processes, and perhaps also even a new definition of productivity, I would say.
That's
Great.
right. That's
Yeah,
right. In fact, one thing I missed out, I'm pretty sure
sure.
my listeners would correlate to this, right?
Hmm.
When you bring in vibe coding like principles into your brownfield projects, right? I'll give you a classical example from some of our clients that we have worked with, right? You start asking, saying, hey, in a create, read, update, delete type model, right? Very simple application. You said that just implement a delete feature, you gave it some insights to it and said, hey, here are the delete capabilities, here's like objects that you want to delete, etc. But then you realize that AI has not just written the code to delete, but has also added additional code for purging, which you never asked for. As a result, what's happened now is your code coverage has reduced, right? You've not tested your purging features and capabilities, you never asked for it. And that's a very simple example I just want to give to our audiences so that they understand vibe coding has these implicit free features that you end up getting into your projects, which otherwise, when we talk about the paradigms that can avoid these, would fix this in the modern day world.
Definitely, Priyank. And, I think when we talk about AI in writing code, I think it almost feels like cheating. It's just that, you put up a prompt and there's this entire code up there. But the real trouble comes right after the JIT push. Developers still run into the same problems they faced before LLMs arrived. Environments drift apart, permissions break in unpredictable ways, and networking works in staging but collapses under real traffic. Rollouts fail, and rollbacks, they do not do what they claim. So these are not exotic issues, but ordinary headaches of shipping software, and they remain even stubbornly hard as code generation becomes more trivial. You argue that we have skipped a crucial step before code generation. So, what exactly is missing in today's AI assisted development workflows?
Again, very valid question and something that we've observed across our customer base as well. The only thing I would say is the specification layer. So we went from describing what you want to generate code without ever agreeing in a structured way of what you're building, why you're building what you're building, with the right constraints or within the right constraints of sorts, and what we are explicitly not building that we've never provided to the AI. As a result, and also this kind of creates, I keep calling these like four problems that no amount of better prompting will solve for you. I keep hearing prompt engineering will fix things for you, etc., etc. I understand, right? Like English, I keep saying this, English is a funny language. But the four problems that I was alluding to earlier are, I just want to simplify this for our listeners. The first one is there is no shared intent. What that means is developers' mental model and AI's interpretation diverge silently. That everyone needs to agree because nobody catches it until the code review happens or the code review is missed, or in worst case you hit production and then you realize, oh, we never did this or never asked for it. So that's the no shared intent problem I keep seeing. The second one I see is your context kind of collapses. What that means is the agent doesn't know your organization's patterns, libraries, constraints. I've said this earlier as well, but it kind of always, when you write a new feature, it reinvents your design system every session because it has not remembered in the context of what was the previous feature. It has not learned from your previous feature. You've not provided anything to it. And then comes your third problem that as a result of all these massive features that you're requesting, you're not putting the right guardrails, you're not putting the right constraints. You have the third problem arising, which is unverifiable bulk output. You will see that the agent returns large PRs with architecture choices you never approved. And the review, in many cases, becomes extremely challenging as well. And that then brings us to the fourth problem statement of sorts is while there is bulk output, there's also this whole notion of knowledge amnesia, where every session kind of starts cold, as I mentioned earlier, right? That agent forgets. Um, so these are the challenges that I am seeing with AI assisted development workflows today. And until you have that specification layer, it's very difficult to solve that. And I keep saying this, right? We gave AI the power to write code, but never gave it the right context to write the right code, right? And spec is that context essentially. So that's what I would say, Priya.
Yeah, Priyank, and I think that's a very sharp insight. And honestly, it explains a lot of the friction why teams are quietly dealing with today. I think, what people miss is that while, AI has dramatically accelerated how fast we can write code, it hasn't necessarily improved how well we understand or what we are building in the first place. And that missing layer that you're pointing to, the clarity or the missing context before creation, I think it feels like the difference between speed and direction. Because, if you think about it, code generation is no longer the bottleneck. The real challenge is defining the problem with enough depth, context, and precision so that what gets generated is actually meaningful, scalable, and totally aligned with business intent. Great, Priyank. You also spoke about specs and why it is important. So, my next question is something related to that only, Priyank, that what do you mean by specs and why we should go with specs and not vibe? And how does it fundamentally change the way teams interact with AI tools?
Right, let me make this really simple for our listeners. Think about how you would brief a new intern walking onto your project. You wouldn't just say, build me a payment screen. I'm just taking up a feature of sorts, right? And walk away for that intern. What you would do with that intern is you would sit with them, explain, saying, here is what the system does today. Here is the users, or here are the users who uses it. Here is what we need to build. Here are the services you can reuse, and here is what explicitly is out of scope, and you would give them a written brief or some sort of an overview, so that there's no confusion of sorts. I mean, you avoid that confusion in the intern. Essentially, spec driven development, or specs in simplistic ways, if you want to call it, I like to call it spec driven development, is exactly that, except that your intern is now your AI agent of sorts. So you write clear, structured spec before the agent generates a single line of code. The spec then, I keep saying this, the spec becomes the shared source of truth for your entire team, and that's where humans and AI kind of collaborate on that spec eventually, and that's what I would call it spec driven development is. And then to your second question around how does it fundamentally change for organizations using this, there are two or three aspects, right? The entire spec driven development angle, now embodied by pretty much every tool that you would latch onto, right? Whether it's Claude Code, Anti-Gravity, Cursor, Klein, you name it, pretty much everyone has adopted it. And even GitHub Copilot, obviously, that's being leveraged across the board as well. So there are four phases, essentially, in terms of how the teams interact. Now, the first phase is you have these slash commands, and I call it like slash specify of sorts, right? So where you describe the goals, you have the agent draft a spec, you iterate until it captures real intent. That's the first flow. The second flow is essentially a slash plan, where you're declaring the architecture, you're clearly calling out the constraints, and as part of the architecture, you're also mentioning, hey, I want to use TypeScript, I want to use AngularJS, or I want to write a backend in Python with a certain structure. You want to bring in Pydantic models of sorts, right, to ensure there's right object-oriented principles imbibed. All that kind of goes in your plan. The third part and the third phase of the workflow comes to be the slash tasks. What then happens is, obviously, you've mentioned the goals through specify, you've planned the feature, and then the agent breaks your work basis the plan and specification that you have provided, or the goals that you have provided, into small units of features or steps that AI will generate, and each feature or each small unit, as I keep saying, right, will be verifiable in its isolation. So that's your third phase, essentially. And then the fourth phase is where your AI or the agent, however you want to call it, starts implementing the feature, right? That's where the slash implement kind of ecosystem comes in, where you're reviewing the focused PRs that get generated, and then humans come in and say, hey, I want to make some changes, go ahead and make manual changes to it, You touch the code, you ensure it follows all your compliance guidelines, it follows all your best practices, security guidelines, and so on and so forth, right? So human checkpoint at every part of those four-phased workflow that I just highlighted, Priya.
Right, Priyank.
Now, fundamentally, things change with spec-driven development. Now, that's what we are heading towards.
Right, Priyank. And it's kind of fundamentally changing the relationship between teams and AI tools, and it also brings in a layer of accountability, I believe, because when outputs don't meet expectations, you don't just say AI messed up. You can go back to the spec, refine it, and make the system better. So I think the entire conversation is shifting from the trial and error to a more specified optimization and design implementation.
Absolutely.
Great. Having said that, Priyank, I think in the early days of generative AI, we were told we needed to become prompt engineers. We tried to write 500-word perfect commands to get the right output. But lately, I have realized something that AI doesn't want a command, it wants a conversation. Because prompt engineering, if we look closely, it's like a transaction. You give an input, you get an output. If it's wrong, you start over. But conversational AI, it's more like a collaboration. So, what are some of the key problems you have witnessed in AI assisted engineering that simply can't be solved by improving prompts?
All right. So this one, I'll start with a distinction here. I think we need to clearly define what is prompt engineering, what happens with it, what doesn't happen. So there's an important distinction here that needs to be discussed and kind of alluded to here first. Prompt engineering optimizes human to LLM interactions. In simplistic ways, what you're saying is how you phrase the ask. That's prompt engineering. Then comes the big piece. That's context engineering. And context engineering essentially optimizes agent to LLM interaction. What that simplifies it, and I want to simplify it for our listeners, is what information the agent has when it works. So how I say this is SDD or spec driven development is the context engineering applied to your entire life cycle, whether it is on the engineering side, product side, in data engineering, the entire saying from insight to execution cycle of sorts, right? Or even you want to call it like within the organization, we call it intelligent product engineering of sorts, right? So that's the distinction I want to highlight here first. So that's what I would say, Priya, that the key problems of, to your point, right, that prompt engineering, I wanted to highlight what prompt engineering is and how spec driven development with the right context brings in practicality. And I believe your subsequent question was what this AI assisted engineering can fix for us. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, I mean, I my specific question was more towards what are certain problems that we are witnessing with AI assisted engineering?
Yeah, makes sense. I remember I mentioned those four areas: no shared intent,
Yeah.
context collapse, unverifiable bulk output, and knowledge amnesia. Now, with the spec driven development, let's map each problem to how a spec would help us. The first one, I think first problem statement we said was it's no shared intent. What happens with this is with spec driven development is the spec is the shared source of truth. The PM, the architect, the QA lead, and the AI all validate the same document before any code is written. That's how the no shared intent problem statement kind of gets solved if we bring in spec approach or spec first approach within the ecosystem. The second problem statement we discussed was context collapse. We said that there is a huge problem where the context is missing, best practices go off. What we do with spec is you write a detailed spec in the context and you execute all, I mean, when I say llms.txt, it's basically take your library, generate that into a skill, have that skill to your agent, and then have it being invoked as you're generating your code and as you're helping build the feature in general, right? So that context collapse now is basically the detailed spec in the form of a skill that you may be having or in the form of a library that you already have, and you have converted that library into a large llms.txt, which is easy for an LLM to read, essentially. The third problem statement I believe we mentioned was unverifiable bulk output. How spec helps us resolve that is you're now breaking for every feature, you have a spec. So what you've done is a spec, that spec is breaking the feature into small tasks, and you're now reviewing focused PR against the spec, not the 1,000 line of dumps or the hundreds or not 100, I would say 15, 20 odd PRs that get or files that get generated against your intuition of sorts, right? So that's not what is happening. And that's where the unverifiable bulk output kind of gets resolved, or at least has a path to a resolution with spec-driven development. And then the last piece, which I've also called out, is knowledge amnesia. I think I mentioned this earlier, the learnings.md file, the skills that you may create, whether it is your best practices for Angular, the patterns that you would use in Angular project or a React project, etc., etc., all kind of compound with every task instead of just resetting to zero. So that knowledge is now baked into in the form of a skill, and the skill is installed on your agent, and that agent leverages the skill as and when you are asking it to generate a feature, etc., etc. Great. I know a long answer to very, very difficult problem statement that the industry is facing towards. Great.
No, definitely, Priyank. And I think, that what you explained is a really important distinction. And I think a lot of things often gets overlooked in the excitement around AI. And I think with AI assistant engineering, it's not just a systems problem. It's more about, the entire system that we are working. It's not just an engineering problem. It's more of a system problem. We need to talk about data quality, context awareness, evaluation frameworks, and even how organizations structure their engineering workflows around AI. So, when we were talking about, specs coding and vibe coding, so you often talk about this 30-day plan to transition from vibe-based coding to spec-driven development model. Can you walk us through that 30-day plan transition? How can organizations achieve that?
All right. So I'll break that into 4 weeks in simplistic ways, right? The week one, I say that should be potentially foundational, right? What that means is you're setting up toolings, you're choosing your right agents, you're choosing the platform that you want to invest within the organization, whether it's Claude Code, Cursor, Klein, Copilot, whatever you have, right? The pattern needs to converge of sorts. Right? And then, as part of the foundation, once you have chosen the tooling, etc., you start building up a constitution for your team's standards. That's test-driven development, solid principles, etc., etc. So you basically are encoding them against as agent plugins. In certain cases, you will be writing skills, as in my prior conversation, and then these skills, or and some of the folks can also call these as rules to simplify things for from an understanding standpoint. So these rule files, the skills, etc., are provided to every session, and they get kind of enforced automatically. So that's your first week, essentially. The foundation, tooling, figuring out those teams' best practices, standards, converting those into plugins in certain cases, as you may want to have skills as well. So that's your week one. At the end of week one, you would first then say that let's figure out. We don't want to give the most complex feature in this paradigm. We want to look at one feature that you want to pilot. So I always recommend my clients look at small or medium sized tickets, Jiras that you may have within your ecosystem, and start with that. So that's your week one. Week two, you've identified the tools in week one, you've identified the best practices, you've written those skills. But now the week two is where you write the first real spec, right? So that's the week two, essentially. You're writing a real spec using the best practices that we mentioned in week one. You are ensuring each of your spec has the right context, goals, the audience for which you're building these features, interactions, the backend contracts, the front end components, the implementation details, and the most underrated section, which is what you are not building and what you should not touch. The last one, which is what you're not building, prevents scope creep and saves a lot of rework. And I also say that the first spec will then help you define the anatomy of a good spec for your teams, because you're going to be evolving, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So don't move. So what we are basically saying is with week two, You want to bring in that habit, and this habit will take time. So you don't want to move to code directly. You want to start generating the spec. And when you use small or medium sized Jiras, it just becomes easier. So that's your week two, Priya. Week three, you start breaking, you take that implementation, you now have more work that's the code has generated. You're breaking that spec into small tasks. Agent builds these specs for you, or in certain cases you generally write the first spec yourself so that you get more comfort and then have AI generated, but ensure that if AI generates, you always keep the tokens in check, because it may end up creating more information, and it could be repetitive in certain sense. So you review the spec that gets generated and then kind of have those repetitions removed. But week three essentially goes to not just the spec, but start capturing learnings. So everything that you've learned, you put it in a learnings.md file or the markdown format file, right? And every workaround, every pattern that worked, did not work, you put everything in that learnings.md file, which you would provide it. And you'd say to your agent next time, saying every time any feature, go back to the learnings.md, look what has worked and what has not worked, so that you're able to start generating better code. Right? So that's your essentially week three, where the agent is reads the learnings for the next session. And week four is essentially now look at how you can really scale, retrospect what has worked, what hasn't worked, how do you train the next team, how do you define your maturity, how do you bring in those context engineering practices. Remember, I mentioned about LLMs or TXT. You may want to take your, you may have MCP servers within your organization for custom libraries, all right, within the organization. So essentially, by week four, you have a proven template that you can replicate across your teams and start then moving it forward to other teams, learning and then adopting. So this is how I see week one to week four kind of shaping away, right? And remember, I keep saying this, day one is not just installing a tool, day one is codifying what your team already knows into a form that AI can use. And that's the step which, in my opinion, everyone skips.
Definitely, Priyank. That's a very structured way to look at it. And, I really liked how you've broken down, what can otherwise feel like an abstract shift into something actionable. And I think that this shift from vibe-based coding to a spec-driven model isn't just a process change. It demands a mindset reset. You are essentially asking teams to move from intuition-led execution to clarity-led engineering. Well, thank you so much, Priyank, for taking all the time and effort to be on a podcast today and helping us understand about, debunking some myths around vibe coding and why spec-driven development is the future and how teams can transition to spec-driven development. And I think code still needs human judgment, especially if it's designed for production. As one veteran put it, AI tools are co-pilots, not autopilots. They can help fly the plane, but a human pilot must chart the course and be ready to grab the controls when turbulence hits. Thank you so much, Priyank, for your insights. It was lovely chatting with you.
Thank you, Priya. And thank you once again for inviting me to the podcast. It was real fun. And as you rightly said, specs, not vibes, is the way forward.
Yeah.
It comes down to making sure you're generating reliable softwares with AI and with human in the mix at the forefront.
Definitely, Priyank. This is for our listeners. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion around spec driven development and why vibe coding is just a hype and how you can achieve spec driven development with some of the processes that Priyank has explained to us. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes, and you can view all our previous episodes on Spotify and other leading platforms. Thank you so much.